This week on Obsessed with Wine.
It's such an honor to get high scores from the critics, and it's very reassuring, and it makes you feel good when they like the wines. But to be honest, I've made dozens of wines that I feel, honestly, in my heart, they're just as good as that wine.
Hey there, wine enthusiasts. My name is Wesley Cable, and I want to welcome you to another brand new episode of the Obsessed with Wine podcast. This week, I've decided to change things up a little bit, and instead of having a regular guest interview, I thought it'd be a good idea to share some highlights from the awesome conversations I've had over the past 17 episodes, especially for those who haven't had the opportunity to listen to every episode. So grab a glass of your favorite wine. It's time for Obsessed with Wine. I consistently say that I do this podcast to talk wine with passionate people and to be inspired. There have been no shortage of inspiring moments over the past 17 episodes. Let's get started. The first clip I want to share is from my very first episode of the podcast. This interview was done with the great Jason Moravec, the winemaker at Visa Tui Winery in St. Helena, California. In this clip, Jason talks about growing up on a vineyard that his parents bought, and how that paved the way for him to go to UC Davis and get his degree in viticulture and enology. Of all the people I've talked to in the world of wine, most of them didn't grow up working in a vineyard or having that kind of experience. So you grew up in Sonoma County, and you guys had 10 acres of Pinot and Chardonnay. I guess it was owned by your parents, right?
That's right, yeah. So my parents are actually, by trade, they're locksmiths, so they're not grape growers. And they had the wonderful plan to retire on a vineyard and grow grapes and sell wine. And so they got into the grape growing business when I was still in high school, and that kind of introduced me to this world. It got me excited about all the hard work that goes into it, how it brings our family together to create a product. And at the end of the day, you have something physical in your hands that you can show for yourself. And so that's where I got started in the business. And we were on 10 acres of grapes. It was Pinot Noir and Chardonnay that we sold to Gloria Ferrer for a sparkling wine. And at that point, I was just so intrigued by the whole process up to the grapes and then all the hard work that goes into that I was so curious about what happens once it goes to the winery. And that's what drove me to go to UC Davis and get my degree in viticulture and enology.
The second clip comes from my interview with winemaker Matt Brain from Alpha Omega Winery. Matt gives his perspective on getting a perfect 100-point score on a wine, which they did for their 2018 Beckstoffer To Kalon Cabernet Sauvignon. Alpha Omega recently had some Beckstoffer To Kalon Cabernet available via allocation. I got an email and I was so tempted to buy it. This was for a different vintage, but a pack of 3 bottles was $999. I really wanted to buy some, but I didn't. This just tells you how special this wine is. Let's hear what Matt had to say about it. You guys produced a 100-point wine at some point in, I think it was a 2018 Beckstoffer To Kalon Vineyard Cabernet Sauvignon.
That's
so
right.
Tell me about that wine. And I mean, what does it mean to you as the winemaker? Like, what does that mean to make a 100-point wine? Like, is it any different than any of the other wines that you make? Or, is it a big deal that we as consumers make it a big deal?
It's such an honor to get high scores from the critics, and it's very reassuring, and it makes you feel good when they like the wines. But to be honest, I've made dozens of wines that I feel, honestly, in my heart, they're just as good as that wine. In a way, it takes the stars to align to get that score. It takes a lot of trust from a critic. They don't want to just give those out to a flash in a pan. They want to see a winery that's doing good things that really deserve that score. I think from a consumer perspective, when you're seeing wines that are scoring consistently, in the mid to high 90s, those are quality, real good quality wines. And I think that the difference between, say, a 95 or a 96 from one critic or a 99 or 100 in the other, it could be the way the light is shining in the window that day. It is so small, the tiny little differences that they're looking for to say that's 100. So I would say this about that 18 To Kalon. It is an incredible wine, as dense, as rich, ripe, hedonistic, yet also definitely Cabernet. It's a complete wine. It's seamless. It's complex and powerful. And it's an amazing wine. I think there are other wines in our portfolio that are maybe, in my mind, more interesting than that wine. But that wine is like the supermodel. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah.
Maybe the personality of someone else is a better match for you. You know what I mean? How would I say this?
Yeah. No, I hear you. Yeah.
And I would say that wine is incredible because it was seamless and flawless, but maybe a little nuanced aromatic, or a little bit of a pokey green note, or a little bit of a roasty barrel note that's kind of sticking out. That may really grab someone's attention. You know what I mean? That may make it a 100-point wine for them. So,
sure.
So I think that 100-point wine it really is so subjective, and it's an incredible recognition, but we just got a bunch of scores back on the 19s, and man, we've got some excellent 95s and 96s and 97s, and nothing up in the 99, 9100s yet this year. But honestly, to see them all come in that high, that to me is rewarding, and it makes me feel good as any 100, because I know that we have done justice to the whole portfolio, that my team is firing on all cylinders, that our palates are on, you know what I mean? And that we're doing a great job across the board.
Clip number 3 comes from my interview with Marianne Turrentine, the Director of Sales and Hospitality at Paradigm Winery in Oakville, California. Most people don't know that the wines at Paradigm have been made by world-famous winemaker Heidi Barrett since its inception. In this clip, Marianne tells a great story about how Heidi joined Paradigm as the winemaker before she started making wine for the cult winery Screaming Eagle. She also talks about what it's like to work with Heidi and what her winemaking style is. So Heidi Barrett is the winemaker, and I think what's interesting is that obviously a lot of people know who she is. She's a very famous winemaker. But the interesting thing is, since the inception of the winery, she's been on as the winemaker there since you guys got started.
Right, yeah. So she was with us before she was with Screaming Eagle. She was with us from day one. Heidi's dad, Dick Peterson, helped Ren kind of design the winery. And Ren needed a winemaker, and actually was thinking Dick may help him make the wine, but Dick Peterson was busy working with other wineries at the time. So Heidi, at that time, she had already worked for some great vineyards and wineries. And Dick suggested, how about Heidi? And Ren's like, great idea. So Ren brought Heidi on board, and it worked out perfectly. And he's always, she's an amazing winemaker. She has such a good way when it comes to blending. It's so interesting to talk to her, and she's so interesting to talk to and wants to share her knowledge. So Ren ended up introducing her to Jeannie, who started Screaming Eagle. Jeannie was Ren's business partner, who he sold real estate with. And when Jeannie was starting her winery, Jeannie asked Ren, hey, I need some help making the wine. Ren's like, I'm not a winemaker. Heidi can help you with that, but our guys can help you farm. So Ren's always been a farmer. So the folks who farm Paradigm Vineyards today actually farmed Screaming Eagle's vineyard like 30 years ago when they launched, when Jeannie launched Screaming Eagle. And then Heidi made the wine. But as you know, it's all different now. Screaming Eagle has changed hands a couple of times. Heidi no longer makes the wine there, but everything at Paradigm is the same. The same people working with the vineyard and the wine, which is pretty special.
So for those people who don't know, what is her winemaking style like, and what does she bring to Paradigm?
So Heidi, her style, she wants to just show the best of what the vineyard gives. And since at Paradigm, everything's farmed on the property, and that's managed in-house, again, by the same crew. We have a GM, General Manager Mark Fozzi, he's been working at Paradigm for over 10 years now, and he manages the vineyard and kind of the winemaking, and then he and Heidi do all the blending and making the heavy decisions together. But the style is just, she says at Paradigm it's really easy because she just wants to showcase the vineyard. So the winemaking is like, the blending comes out. When I see Heidi come to the winery, it's about the blending and also the aging, the barrel aging, using about, half new French oak and then half barrels that have been used a time or two before. You don't want to mask all the fruit. So you want to make sure you get these nuances. The barrel is like the cooking spices and it adds some complexity, but you want to be able to taste the fruit because you work so hard in the vineyard. And then when it comes to the blending, it's so interesting to see like, oh, this Cabernet is amazing, but this 1% Petit Verdot is going to make this huge difference, or this Merlot, or whatever it is. And it's like,
it's funny how that works. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so amazing. So I think the style is just to make sure that you see all the nuances that you can get out of wine, and you're not going to need to mask anything. So you can just kind of have these different layers and the complexity and some balance.
So do you realize how lucky you are to be able to do that every day and watch her work and all that stuff? I mean, what a really cool situation to be in.
Yeah, I feel really lucky, for sure. It's a lot of fun. Like I said, it's such a down-to-earth crew, too. So it's just nice to be there and ask questions and get things explained and understand it. It's pretty neat.
The next clip comes from my interview with Matt Villard, owner and winemaker of MCV Wines in Paso Robles, California. MCV Wines is known for their great Petite Sirah and Petite Sirah blends. In this clip, Matt Villard talks about the bottle of wine that made him fall in love with Petite Sirah and his goal to develop a cold weather Petite Sirah in Oregon before getting settled in Paso Robles. Why Petite Sirah, and what drew you to those grapes?
I still remember the bottle that really put me on to Petite Sirah. When you're in college and you don't have a lot of money and you want to buy some wine, you're drinking Bogo and whatever else, like Petite Sirah. I was like, I like Petite Sirah, but I still remember the bottle that made me think the Petite Sirah is special, something we worked with. I was tasting wine with my dad in Paso. We were probably staying with my grandparents in Cayucas. That's where I was living. When I was working for Justin, I lived there, but we would go over and we'd taste in Paso a lot. And I'm not even sure I was 21 at the time, but we were tasting at EOS. And so they used to have something called the Coupe Grande. And so they had Chardonnay and Petite Sirah. And this is back in like 2002, 2003. They had a $60 Petite Sirah in 2003. I think it was worth every penny, but it really opened my eyes to what Petite Sirah could be. It was elegant. It was beautiful. It was ageable, just amazing. And so that is the bottle that really kind of turned me on to Petite Sirah. And from there on, I went back and I was working for Andy Walker at Davis, he's a very famous grape breeder. And so my goal was to move to Oregon and crossbreed Pinot and Petite Sirah until I came out with a colder weather ripening grape that would have more body and tannin than Pinot Noir, and maybe more like basically Petite Sirah, but cold weather. And so it didn't happen, obviously. I'm in Paso Robles.
The next clip comes from my interview I did with Kristen Sheeler, associate winemaker at a Columbia winery in Woodinville, Washington. What I really liked about my interview with Kristen is she got started in her wine journey later in life after she raised her kids. This proves that it's never too late to pursue your passion. In this clip, Kristen talks about the beginning of her wine journey as a woman in a class full of men and how her hard work and dedication got her first internship at a winery.
Well, there were probably about 20 people in the class, and one of them was already a winemaker who had a winery. And he came to me, and I worked very hard. Like, in addition to going to the classes, they had practicals where you would put together pumps and so forth. But there were a lot of men. I was one of the few women in the class, and they are all very familiar with the equipment. And I wasn't in any way intimidated, but it wasn't easy to get in there, let's say. So I would go before class or after class and ask the professor to work with me and just say, can I have a little one-on-one time so I can learn to do this? And one of my classmates, the person that owned the winery, he saw how hard I was working and my desire to really understand things and be able to actually do it. And he came up and asked me if I had an internship yet. And I said, no, I don't. And he said, do you want one? I said, absolutely. So I started there. And that was in Woodinville, and it was a small boutique winery, but also this person did custom crush. So I started doing small boutique custom crush work, and that's where I got my start. And it was a lot of squeegeeing the floors. Learning how to inoculate things and doing rudimentary lab work, just PhD, things like that. And it was a really great experience. And then, of course, learning how to drive that forklift.
The next clip comes from my interview with Margarita Posteronka, the talented viticulturist at Shandon in Napa. Margarita is from Moldova, where she graduated college with a degree in wine before pursuing her graduate degree at UC Davis in viticulture and enology. In this clip, Margarita talks about how she couldn't believe it when she received her acceptance certificate to UC Davis and how it changed her life and career. So after you finished and you ended up coming back to California and going to UC Davis to get your master's degree in viticulture and enology. So how did you hear about UC Davis and why did you choose UC Davis?
Well, the first time I've heard about it back in Moldova. That's one thing I did hear about because it was always brought up as one of the best universities for wine, viticulture and enology research. The dean of the faculty at the time, he visited UC Davis at some point. So he even visited it. And so he always spoke about it very highly. So I did hear about that, like I said, back in Moldova. And then, of course, after I spent a year in California, a few of my of the people on the SHI team were UC Davis graduates. So I did hear about it. I've always heard about it. To be honest, until I got in, I never thought it would be possible. I remember the day I got my acceptance letter. It was like, wow, this is something if someone told me this even 2 years ago, I would have never believed that. So I was very, very excited to get in and to start my program there.
All right. So now you're at Davis and you went for a master's degree. So I know a lot of people who went to Davis, they got a bachelor's degree and they have a successful career working in winemaking, doing whatever they're doing. So why a master's degree? Why was that important to you? Why did you want to do that?
Well, because I already felt like I had quite a bit of knowledge from my previous degree. Again, my university was quite strong, especially in chemistry and sciences. And second, from just work experience, I've done my internship at Scheid, and then I also spent almost a year working as an assistant winemaker in Moldova until I got accepted to UC Davis. So I have already had some practical experience and technical experience. So I definitely thought that master's that I was a better fit for a program and the program was a better fit for me. I also really like the fact that it's a combined program. I know that people have mixed feelings about that because you kind of learn a little bit of both, but it actually changed my life and my professional life, and we'll get to it later. But the fact that I was exposed a lot to the viticultural aspects and viticultural subjects, again, really changed my future career.
Our next clip comes from one of my favorite interviews. This interview is with Anita and Verinder Sahi, owners and winemakers at Copia Vineyards and Winery in Paso Robles, California. The reason this is one of my favorite interviews is that I've always dreamed of making my own wine and having my own label. But I'd never spoken to anyone who was actually doing that until my interview with the Sahis. In this clip, they talk about how they got their name for their wine and winery and what the name Copia means. So I want to ask you, because this is something that, I've thought of a lot, and I said this earlier, as a lot of people who love wine and winemaking think, gosh, it'd be so great to have my own winery and do all that stuff. So you guys named it Copia Vineyards and Winery. So where did the name come from, and what does the name mean?
Well, just like the property, the name came to us too. It was the existing brand from the DeWitts, Michael and Andrea, who owned this plot of land before us. And it means abundance. It's a Latin root word. So the words that you might be familiar with, cornucopia or copious. So it has a lot to do with harvest, obviously. We didn't know, whether that was something that we were going to do. In fact, we didn't even know that the name or the brand was available until just towards the end, before closing on the property, when Michael said, "Hey guys, I think you guys are going to do things in such a fun way that what do you think about carrying on the legacy of Copia?" And we we didn't really give it much thought. We were probably just going to call it Sahi Family Vineyards. We said, well, let's try the wine. Let's meet the winemaker and the owner in his element and see what it's like. The wine was excellent, and the winemaker is such a character that there's a lot of heart and there was a lot of goodwill behind this brand. And we felt actually honored to be able to carry it on. And we've taken, the opportunity over the last few years to really make Copia our own. And Verinder always tells a story of how when we first came to this property, that we had this feeling of fullness, just an overwhelming feeling of being in the right place, that feeling of plentiful and of feeling grateful. That was something that resonated with us. So the name came to us and it stuck, and we're very, very happy to have it.
Our final clip comes from my interview with Richie Allen, the Vice President of Winemaking and Viticulture at Rombauer Vineyards. In this fascinating clip, Richie talks about the impact of smoke on growing vines and if we'll see any 2020 red wines from Rombauer due to the fires. I was going to ask you about the 2020 vintage, especially red wines. A lot of companies, I think, are saying no to any red wines for 2020 based on all the smoke and that kind of stuff. So will we see any red wines from Rombauer for 2020?
Yeah, so smoke taint, it's interesting. So there's a lot of factors that play into, especially a red wine or any wine, any grape picking up smoke taint. We know that variety plays a part. So different varieties are more affected by smoke taint. If you could have Chardonnay and Zinfandel at one end, which are relatively less affected, they can still pick up smoke taint, but they're less affected. And Pinot Noir and Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot at the other end, especially Pinot Noir, a little bit of smoke seems to heavily affect them more than, say, Chardonnay. The other things that come into play are the density of the smoke, the length of exposure. There's some anecdotal evidence that the freshness of the smoke plays a part. But if you have a long enough exposure, it doesn't matter how fresh the smoke is, you can still pick up the density of the smoke. So it's very hard to predict from a winemaking standpoint when a wine or grapes or vines are exposed to smoke, how much smoke they're going to pick up. There's also the period in which they're exposed. So if it's pre-veraison, grapes tend to not be affected. Post-veraison, and veraison is that point where they start to soften and accumulate sugar. If they're red grapes, develop color. The point when you start veraison is when they're most affected. And it decreases slightly as you get to harvest, but there's still a very high risk. Knowing all of those things, it's very hard to predict. So 2020, most of our Chardonnay, honestly, was totally fine. We lost about 15% of our Sauvignon Blanc because it was more affected by smoke taint. Our Cabernet and Merlot were totally destroyed. They were exposed twice for very long periods of time, very close proximity to high density smoke, and it wasn't worth it. Now, the Zinfandel is less affected. Now, Zinfandel comes from the Sierra foothills. And so they were a lot further from the fires. They did get some smoky days, but not enough density of smoke or freshness of smoke, and the variety doesn't pick it up. So our 2020 Zinfandels were okay. That being said, the Petit Syrah from up there for 2020, we had to sell off and destroy. We'll have a Zinfandel for 2020. It actually tastes quite amazing. Very proud of it. We just bottled it recently. The Cab and the Merlot, it just wasn't worth it. There was nothing we could do. It's interesting. In 2020, we sent samples all over the world to Australia. We were using labs here. We were testing, and we started to develop our own internal protocols for what level of bound and free smoke compounds are acceptable in wines, what we figured our background, because you'll always have some background smoke in any grape variety when you test it. And so we had to sort of figure out very quickly what was acceptable, what was background, what was actual smoke taint. Were we willing to run the risk of bottling something with smoke taint? And the Rombauer family were like, why would you do that? Don't do that. Why would you run the risk? Like, we're 40 years in. Why would you risk it now? That's a great example of why I work for the Rombauer family. They're like, why would you risk bottling a wine that could be bad for customers? Don't do that. Now, other companies, they'll be forced to. Maybe they're hoping. Maybe they weren't anywhere near the fires, and they are okay. But there's a lot of people who will be forced to bottle wines, unfortunately, which are no good. And we're in a lucky position. We didn't have to do that.
These are only a few clips from the 17 great guests we've had on the show so far. If you've missed any episodes, you can find every episode of the show on the show website at www.obsessedwithwine.net. As you may have noticed, I've suspended the daily taste segments indefinitely because the time they take to create was taking away from the time I needed to prepare for the weekly episodes. In its place, I've decided to start the Obsessed with Wine blog, where I'll be posting 2 times a week. You can find these posts starting July 1st on obsessedwithwine.net. I'm excited to share these with you, and I think they'll complement the show perfectly. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you next week for another episode of Obsessed with Wine podcast. Until then, cheers!